So this is Ofori, the digital reader, and this is the battery life test for my iPad Air 4th generation focusing on reading comic books. Now, with all of my battery life tests, there are a couple things I try to do. I try to read every day for at least an hour. In this situation, I really changed it to try and read at least one comic book a day. Track the days it took me to finish the book. Here it's going to be track how long it took to finish a comic, track the time that I read the comic, and track the battery percentage for me to start and to finish the comics. And I'm going to be tracking it from 100% to 10%. I already did a battery life for reading books, but with reading digital comics, I wanted to just see what the battery life was like because I realized the power consumption is going to be more intense for one major reason. When I'm reading books, I usually will end up refreshing the screen only when I turn the page, which is usually once every 1 or 2 minutes. But with comic books, especially if you're reading with panels, you're actually refreshing the screen every couple seconds. And even if you're reading the whole page, you're usually refreshing the screen every 20 or 30 seconds. So I felt like the power consumption was going to be a lot more. I'm going to be testing the battery life just normal with Wi-Fi on and no Bluetooth. For my iPad, I rarely use Bluetooth just because I don't really need to. And then I'm going to be testing it with the Wi-Fi off and the Bluetooth off. And what I did is I downloaded all the comics ahead of time and just turned off the Wi-Fi just so I can get a feel for it. So, like I said, this is really just kind of a lark. At the end of the battery life stuff, I will show you the rankings of all my devices so you can see what the iPad Air did as far as battery life when reading books. So let's get started. So I read the first 2 issues of Scales and Scoundrels. That took me from 100% to 98%, and that was 55 pages that I read. And I read for 7.25 minutes for one day. Then I read The Adventures of Red Sonja, Volume 1. That took me from 97% to 68%, and that was 137 pages because it was a collection of several issues. And I read that for 1 hour, 37 minutes over one day. Then I read Barbaric. That took me from 67% to 64%, and that was 111 pages. And I read that for 14 minutes over one day. Barbaric didn't have any text in it, no word balloons or anything. So I really blew through it because I was just basically looking at pages with no words. So it was just a picture book basically. This is Ofori with a correction from the future. Scales and Scoundrels and Barbaric do have captions. What happened is when I downloaded them, I converted them from PDF to comic book format. And somehow in the settings of the conversion to comic book format, it dropped the captions. I did not realize that until later on when I was looking up information about the comics to kind of talk about my feelings and see the author and all that information. And I realized, oops, these are not silent comics or comics with no captions. These do have captions. It doesn't affect my battery life test because the time it took for me to go through the comics is what actually counts for the battery life, not whether they had captions or not. But it's something I wanted to correct going forward. Then I read James Bond Casino Royale. That took me from 62% to 21%, and that was 179 pages. And I read that for 1 hour, 47 minutes over 2 days. Then I read the first 54 pages of the Crazy Cat and Ignatz Mouse comic strip collection, and that took me from 19% to 10%, and I read that for 46 minutes over one day. So the total battery life for the iPad with Wi-Fi on reading digital comics was 6 days, and over that 6 days, I read for 4.5 hours. And now for what I read on my iPad with the Wi-Fi off. I finished up Crazy Cat and Ignatz Mouse, and that was the last 127 pages. That took me from 100% to 85%, and that was 49 minutes. I read that over the course of a day. Then I read A Contract with God and Other Tenement Stories, which took me from 84% to 70% power, and that was 206 pages. And I read that for 45 minutes over one day. And then I read ElfQuest, and for the first 352 pages that I read, I should also note that the ElfQuest, I didn't realize it at the time because it wasn't super expensive, but the ElfQuest comic book collection was the whole ElfQuest comic book collection from beginning, the first issue, to the very last issue. And it's actually 700 pages. So I was about halfway through it at 352 pages. And as I mentioned, that took me from 68% to 10%. And that took me 3 hours and 20 minutes over 4 days to read. So with Wi-Fi off, the total battery life was over 6 days. I read for 4.9 hours. So there isn't a huge difference between Wi-Fi on and Wi-Fi off. So I'm just going to leave my Wi-Fi on. I always have a charger and I'll just top it up whenever I need to. As far as looking at the other devices for comparison, you can see that when I was reading books on my iPad Air, I got 9.85 hours in the battery life, which is much more than when I was reading comic books. And also, when I put the iPad Air in low power mode, I got almost 12 hours, 12 and a half hours out of it. I'm using so much energy when I'm changing panels and the constant tapping every couple seconds. It's almost like playing a game. I will note one other thing that I did not realize, to be honest, there is a decent bit of eye strain reading these comic books. And I know that next year I'm definitely going to be getting a matte screen protector on my iPad before I start comic book month again. So those were the battery life numbers. I'm not going to put it in my official charts because this is just focused on digital comics. All of my other battery life tests are focused on reading digital books. But still, I just thought it'd be fun to know. So that's it. This is Ofori, the digital reader. Of course, if you have questions, leave them in the comments.